And thank you for joining us. We're fortunate to have Brett Fairburn, the incoming president of Thompson River University, with us today to provide an introduction to cooperatives. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can either put up your hand or type any question concerns into the questions pane of the control panel. Also, if you have questions for the speaker, you may send your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect these and address them during the question and answer portion of the presentation. So I am going to turn it over to Brett and mute myself. So Brett, go ahead.
Thanks. So am I on camera at the moment, or are we looking at the presentation?
I can see you, but I can't see the presentation. So
well, I'll start it up in a minute. Just by way of introducing myself, I know Sean mentioned, but since I have kind of two hats, I thought maybe I'd begin by showing you my two hats. So that's my first hat, so incoming president at TRU, and my other hat, so here's a United Grain Growers hat, a historic agricultural marketing cooperative. So this is me as a historian of cooperatives, university faculty member and professor, and this is me in my new upcoming role, looking very much forward to getting out in BC. So with that by way of introduction, I'll just start up the slideshow here, and we'll get going. So let's see now. And play slideshow from start. So how are we doing technically, Sean? Is that good?
Yes, everything's good. I can see your presentation fine, and I can see you fine as well.
Well, perfect. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. Cooperatives are certainly a subject that's of keen interest to me, and I'm happy to talk for a little bit about an introduction to cooperatives. And I want to emphasize the introduction. This is general, may lead to your questions, and I've called it the who, what, where, why, when of co-ops. I mentioned a little bit about me. You have some of that on there, and I won't dwell on that. But certainly that's the background that I bring to cooperatives. I've taught about the history and the governance of cooperatives, done research on that subject. And I wanted to mention my current research project, which is working with the people in the cooperative retailing system, which is a system of retail and in the context of agriculture, farm supply cooperatives across Western Canada from BC to Northern Ontario. They and their Central Wholesaler Federated Cooperatives Limited form a network with about 1.8 million people as individual member owners, and close to 200 independent cooperatives, including some in BC. And with them, I'm working on a study of their organizational transformation in about the last decade, where they've been working on areas like their talent management, their brand or their strategy, corporate performance management, and information technology, and more. But this part of that really interests me is the part that's specific to a cooperative. So what's different in a cooperative when you go through those kinds of changes? So that may give you a little bit of a sense of the kind of things that I do. I interview managers and leaders in cooperatives, and some of that will inform my perspective in this talk. So what I'm looking to cover here is really the who, what, where, why, when, understanding co-ops, the definition of cooperatives and some of the key features of cooperatives, looking at some history and some examples. I find some people understand better from the abstract description of what something is, and sometimes what you need is some concrete examples. So I'll try and cover both. I want to dwell for a little bit on co-op governance and strategy, which is a particular interest of mine, and touch a little bit on kind of the general approach to creating and developing cooperatives, which might be an interest for some of you in BC. What I probably won't spend much time on is kind of the nitty-gritty of how to form a cooperative. What are the steps you take? How do you incorporate it? There are, however, some resources for going about doing that, and I've mentioned a few on the slide here. Cooperatives First is a cooperative development agency for Western Canada that specializes in rural and First Nations cooperative development, Indigenous cooperative development. And I've also given the links here for the BC Cooperative Association and for Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada. These are associations of existing cooperatives that can often be helpful in terms of providing contacts and advice about where to go when you're interested in forming a co-op. And I'm happy, by the way, to share these slides so you don't have to scramble to write this all down. You can have them available afterwards. So what I want to kind of stress as a key beginning point is, and this is really the summary of the whole presentation. So first of all, co-ops are a widely distributed model. They're not uncommon. There's lots of them out there. There's lots of examples. The second key idea in this presentation is that co-ops behave differently from other businesses because of how they're owned and controlled. In other words, because of their governance. And the third thing then is, if you're thinking, where is a co-op a good fit? You know, should we form a co-op for what we're interested in? Should we recommend it to someone else? I'd say a co-op is the appropriate choice when members desire that behavior that's different, that different behavior that comes from being a co-op, rather than being a different form of organization. So at a high level, that's what the whole talk is about. And you know, if that's all the detail you need, then you're certainly free to log off. The rest of it is really just filling in what some of those things mean. Let me see here. I'm not able to advance my, there we go. So in terms of understanding co-ops, the definition and the key features, I mentioned this is where I want to focus for some time. There is, I think, the best single resource anywhere on what is a co-op is by an international organization of cooperatives called the International Cooperative Alliance, the ICA. They've adopted something called the Statement on the Cooperative Identity, and this is listed on their website. And I'll mention there's other definitions of cooperatives, there's other ways of characterizing them. I'll refer to some of those for you. But this one, if you're only going to look at one thing, this is actually really good. And I would say, as a historian of cooperatives, as a scholar and researcher of cooperatives, this one-page document sums up really, really concisely about 100 or 200 years of discussions among cooperatives about who they are and what characterizes them. So it's actually a really rich single-page document. So I thought I'd show you a picture of it. You know, you can look it up online, but here's just an image that you see what it looks like. It fits on a single page, and it has several sections in it that I want to comment on. So there's really three components to the statement. The first is there is a definition of a cooperative, and I'll walk through this in a moment. Then there's a statement of values, and third, there's a list of principles. And I mentioned that there are three parts because people in cooperatives often refer to the whole thing as the cooperative principles, and they skip over a couple of really important things that I want to show you when all they talk about are the principles. So starting with the definition of a cooperative, what this document says is that a cooperative is an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. And if that maybe sounds a little bit like it was written by a committee with a lot of compromises and wording negotiation, that's because that's exactly where it came from. So this was an international committee of people in 1995 that kind of captured everything in a single sentence. But I want to parse that for you and kind of show you the key pieces. So first of all, a cooperative is an association of persons. It's not not a single person acting on their own. It's the kind of cooperatives we talk about in Canada are not informal networks of people who just happen to work together. They're actually formal associations, and typically incorporated, formalized membership bylaws, the whole works. But also, a cooperative is a group of people who meet their needs through an enterprise. And most often, cooperatives are businesses, and it's good to think of them as being businesses. Even when they operate in sectors in Canada that we don't think of as being business sectors, like healthcare, for example, they have many of the characteristics of an enterprise because they're responsible for managing their own resources. They have to be efficient and effective usually they're in competition with other forms of enterprise, and if they don't do a good job of how they deliver services to their members, they can cease to exist. They can go out of business. So I think the common state for cooperatives, and really it's embedded in the definition, is that they compete with other forms of organization, usually in a market or in a marketplace, something like that. So an association and an enterprise, and specialists in cooperatives refer to this as the association enterprise duality. There's a fancy name for it that characterizes co-ops, but the short form is that if you think about a co-op, you want to think about it as being a group of people, and you want to think about it as being a business, an enterprise, and both of those at the same time. That dual character is part of the definition of a cooperative. Now, one of the other things about a cooperative is that it's an association of people to meet their own needs. If you talk to people in the co-op sector, one of the most common things you'll hear is that co-ops exist to meet needs, to meet the needs of members. That's part of the definition. And I'll say more in a moment about why this is a really distinctive feature of cooperatives. But cooperatives meet their members' needs. People join them not maybe just because it's a good idea, not because they'll get some investment return from it. They join them because they want their needs met. And as the phrase says, economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of why people form co-ops and what particular needs or aspirations they're looking to meet. And they do that through an enterprise that they own jointly and control democratically, and that's a central part of the definition as well. So the members who use the services, who have the needs to be met, are the ones who own and control the enterprise. So I guess, kind of summing up what that means and what some of the implications are. So first of all, if you're working with a cooperative, with a group of people who want to form one, if you want to form one or you're leading one, you want to think about that association enterprise duality. How does the cooperative bring together a membership dynamic with a business, an enterprise that it's operating? You want to think about that idea that the members who own the cooperative are also the people who use its services and whose needs are met. So it's an identity between the member owners and the users. In real life, there's variations. Often co-ops serve some non-members. Often people join them and then don't use the services. So you can think of it as a bit of a spectrum, but in a well-functioning co-op, there's a very high degree of overlap between those who use the services and those who take on the responsibility of ownership. And then that third point, that co-ops exist to meet the needs and aspirations of members. And to do that, they have to know what their members want, and they have to know what the members value and deliver on that. So those are some implications that come right out of the definition of a co-op. Now, I mentioned the values and principles. The ICA, it's a pretty good list. Other co-ops might list slightly different things, but they say co-ops are based on values of self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equity, equality, and solidarity. And those are, what the ICA is saying here is that really anyone who forms a cooperative is pretty much always inspired by a cluster of values that are like these ones. If you're thinking, where is a co-op a good fit, where is it not? It's a good fit when when values like these particularly matter to a group of people. So if they're interested in equitable treatment in the marketplace, equitable relationships among members, that's a reason to form a cooperative. And then what the statement says is that the cooperative principles are guidelines by which the values are put into practice. So that's worth thinking about. The definition is kind of, almost universal, pretty much so. The values are pretty universal. The principles are guidelines, so they're worth considering, but in practice they vary. And these, you can look them up. I'm not going to talk about each of them individually. But I just wanted to show you that this is the cooperative principles. And when people in co-ops talk about the principles, this is the list that they mean. Member economic participation means that members participate in supporting the co-op through their investments and or their purchases or their deliveries of product in a marketing co-op. Autonomy and independence is equally important. And I'll probably refer along the way to why cooperatives value education, training, and information so much. So I could say more about all of those, but maybe we can come to that in the questions. So in terms of summing up what the differences are between co-ops and other forms of enterprise, I guess first of all, I'd say you can think about there being enterprises out there where owners, so not a co-op, where owners provide service to someone else and the earnings are kept by or go to the owners. So that's kind of the conventional model in the economy. We could call it an investor-owned firm or a for-profit business. The owners are getting the surplus, the profit, and they're providing service to some other group besides the owners. You know, the owners of a corporation serving customers out there, as the case may be. Then you could think about businesses where the owners provide service to someone else, but they don't take any particular benefit for themselves. And we think about those as not-for-profits. So that's charity, that's philanthropy. And again, there's lots of those kinds of organizations out there. And what I want to show by putting it up this way is that both those models are different from co-ops. Co-ops are a third model that isn't like, or isn't just like either of those two. So cooperatives are where the owners are the users. They're not providing service to someone else. It's that self-help, self-responsibility dynamic. That's what characterizes a co-op and distinguishes it from other businesses. So again, if you're thinking where do co-ops fit, it's where a group has the capacity to undertake the business for themselves, or where they want to and need to develop that capacity to be the owners to manage the operation of the business as well as be the users. So that's the co-op model as distinguished from for-profit or from not-for-profit. There's other definitions out there I mentioned. If you go to Germany, they might say co-ops are defined by self-help, self-administration, and self-responsibility. That's kind of reflected in the ICA definition. Co-ops in Germany and Canada and other countries have used the slogan all for one and one for all. One of the better ones that's out there is the historic slogan of the North American credit union movement, which is not for profit, not for charity, but for service. And that's their way of capturing that distinction from those other sectors. They're not for profit, they're not for charity, they exist for the service to the members. And you could characterize them as mutual self-help, so people helping themselves in a group rather than individually, helping themselves to do things they couldn't do as individuals. And the United States Department of Agriculture has a definition that a lot of people find useful. They say if you look at an organization and it's owned by the users, controlled by the users, for the benefit of the users, then it's a co-op. And not necessarily dependent on the form of incorporation, by the way. That's one of the things about these definitions. It's whether that relationship exists between the co-op and meeting the needs of the members. So that's a quick introduction from my perspective to the definition and key features of cooperatives. And then I want to move on and talk about some examples and some of the differences in different times and places. So you could think about where are co-ops, and the United Nations did a survey about 4 years ago and discovered that in terms of people who are members of cooperatives, there's more than 1 billion people in the world who are members of about 3 million cooperatives. So I said it was a widespread model. This is really quite widespread. So then you might say, where are those? And there's a little bit of information about parts of the world and about sectors. So the largest number of cooperatives in that 3 million are agricultural cooperatives. The largest number of members of that 1.2 billion members are members in credit unions, in financial cooperatives. In terms of regions, Asia has 484 million or so members of cooperatives. Some of the countries that stand out are India, South Korea, and Japan. And I should say, by the way, that the numbers that the International Co-op Movement uses don't generally include cooperatives in China. And that's because looking at the cooperative law in China, looking at the political and economic system in China. I think a lot of people have doubts about whether the autonomy aspect of cooperatives is really respected in the Chinese system. So that 484 million is primarily in the other countries. Europe has a bit less than 400 million. Big sectors include agricultural and credit cooperatives in France. Italy has consumer co-ops and all kinds of co-ops, but probably famous for social co-ops. Spain for the Mondragon workers cooperatives. Switzerland, an interesting footnote would be that the two largest retailers in the nation of Switzerland are both cooperatives. So again, these are countries you think of for other reasons. Switzerland you think of as maybe a classic capitalist country, but in fact there's big co-ops. In North America, about 135 million members of cooperatives, and by far the largest proportion of those are in the United States. The USA has a huge credit union movement, big agricultural co-ops, other kinds of co-ops I'll refer to in a bit. Where these came from historically is every group in the population that saw a need. So the British co-ops are sometimes looked to as kind of the founders of the current world co-op movement. That was an urban wage earners movement, a working class movement from the mid-19th century. The famous Rochdale cooperative that a lot of people in co-ops refer to as having helped set the principles of co-ops. Germany, it was more about small business and tradespeople forming co-ops, farmers forming co-ops. In Eastern Europe, it was national minorities in Poland, in what's now the Czech Republic, in Hungary and other areas. Before the countries were independent, the people formed co-ops to kind of defend their economic interests. So I could give lots of examples of different economic and social groups who formed co-ops, but the only point I really wanted to make here is that co-ops are formed by anyone who was really looking for an alternative to the conventional business model. So for something that would behave differently than the other forms of business. In Canada, to give you a quick mention, there's many kinds of cooperatives. The largest number of cooperatives in Canada are housing co-ops. Those are almost all urban. There's a couple of thousand of those, including in Vancouver. I did a little bit of poking around on the web just to give some BC examples. The largest number of members are in credit unions. There's something like 10 million people in Canada who are members of credit unions, and some of the big ones in BC include Van City as well as First West. The largest volume of business is in the retail and the agricultural cooperatives. Mountain Equipment Co-op is a big retail co-op with millions of members, and Federated Cooperatives Limited, that the one I do research on, is a wholesale manufacturing central cooperative that has 10 or $15 billion a year in sales volume. Where in Canada are co-ops strongest? Short answer would be Quebec. So maybe that gives just a little bit of sense for people who maybe weren't aware of it, what kinds of organizations are out there, where are they, and that there are some in BC. And I did want to spotlight agriculture. I know that's an interest for those of you in this webinar. So in Canada, cooperatives in agriculture currently are present in commodity marketing, I think especially in pork and chicken, with significant proportions of those markets nationwide. In terms of marketing and processing and value added, it's really the dairy sector that has some of Canada's biggest cooperatives. Agropura in Quebec, Gailey Foods in Ontario are big processing cooperatives in the dairy sector, and some more specialized ones include some of the cheese manufacturing cooperatives, and I put up a couple of the names of them in the slide. There are organic marketing cooperatives. I noticed Glen Valley and Langley. I found that on the internet, so some in BC, as well as farmers market cooperatives, which are more common in the prairies, but I was interested to find out that there's some of those in BC as well. So there's cooperatives in marketing, processing, specialized marketing, value chains, and kind of farmers markets as that connection between farmers and consumers. Supply cooperatives is a big sector. Quebec has Co-op Fédéré. In Ontario, Growmark is primarily a supply cooperative. Alberta has UFA Co-op. And then, of course, there's federated co-ops that I mentioned. Farmers of North America, some of you may have come across, that's their business too. Seed cleaning co-ops, transportation co-ops, rural utilities cooperatives. One thing that we don't have in Canada is what I've called on the slide big integrated co-ops. So co-ops that are huge businesses that purchase commodities, that trade commodities, that process many different commodities into many different kinds of food, not just dairy, but other things. But we do have big co-ops like that in the United States. And one of them I mentioned here is CHS Co-op, which has actually come across the border and has had some operations in Canada. So that's a little bit of a sense of what goes on in agriculture with co-ops. Points to consider: any line of business you can think of, somewhere, someone has created a co-op to do that. One of the great scholars of cooperatives before he passed away was Professor Ian McPherson from the University of Victoria. Ian was a wonderful, incredibly knowledgeable person. He used to say that he'd found a cooperative somewhere in the world in every field of business except mining. And then he found a mining cooperative. So really, no one has been able to identify a field that cooperatives have not been active in. However, proportionate to population, farmers and rural people have probably incorporated more cooperatives than any other segment of the population. It's interesting to think about why that might be, and I'll maybe just leave that question to hang for now. So it's a little bit about history and examples of cooperatives, and I just want to, keep on through the presentation here and leave time for questions. So I want to say a word about how co-ops work from my perspective, which is really about governance and strategy. So how does who owns and controls co-ops affect how they behave? So I'd begin and maybe take a step back that everyone talks about governance these days. And often when people use the word governance, what they mean is really the type of relationship between the board of directors and the general manager or the CEO. And that is a governance question. But I would say that especially when thinking about cooperatives, it's helpful to use a bigger frame. So my colleagues and I would use a particular definition of governance, and this is from the Institute on Governance, that says that governance is a framework for the allocation of power within an organization. And a good paraphrase of that is that governance in any organization is about who decides what and who has a say over what. So who calls the shots really? And governance, will say the board does this, the CEO does that, but different stakeholders will have their interests represented in different ways. In a co-op, the members may have a say, the employees, the middle management may have a say, the community may have a say. And when people have a voice, when they affect decisions, that's part of governance too. So I'd really come from kind of that multi-stakeholder perspective. And someone does make a decision. Someone kind of has the final say on most things. But it also makes a difference who's heard along the way. So one of the key points that I'd really want to convey is that organizations that are governed differently behave differently because different people are calling the shots. So if your organization is run in the interests of investors and it's all about shareholder value, that will lead to a different behavior than if your organization is run to meet the needs of local members who are the ultimate owners. And that, again, will be different from a philanthropic organization where it's philanthropists calling the shots for someone else's benefit. So co-ops behave differently because they're owned by their users. And the reason to form a co-op, if it makes sense to form a co-op in any given situation, is because you want them to behave differently. You want them to serve that particular group of users. I mentioned strategy in relation to governance, and to me, these two concepts are really closely intertwined. Governance shapes whose strategy gets adopted for a co-op and how that, or for any organization, and how that plays out in real life. So typical pieces of that in a co-op, and maybe to take a little bit of an ideal case here, you have a board of directors that represents the interests of the user members. The board shares with management the responsibility for setting long-term vision and goals for the organization. And then once management and the board have come to a common view about where things are going in the long run, then management is responsible for the operations and does so in a well-functioning co-op, informed by the values of the organization. And all organizations have values. In co-ops, those are particular values. Members may be involved, depending on the size and the nature of the co-op, to varying degrees in providing feedback or input along the way. So that's a little bit about how different actors in a co-op interact with each other in shaping strategy. And that leads to different outcomes. So one of the things I'm always interested in when I look at examples of cooperatives is that organization behaving differently because it's a co-op compared to if it was a different form of enterprise. So one thing that you'll often see with co-ops is that they invest and reinvest where their members are in terms of physical location, especially for co-ops that are based on local ownership, and or they invest in what their members care about. So some examples of that: the co-ops in the co-op retailing system that I'm studying currently are owned in regions across Western Canada. These days usually bigger than a single town, but usually a small region, a town and surrounding area, a few towns, or in a big city for that matter, but a significant number of people. And the co-ops, you can see visibly when you drive through and look at the communities, invest differently in their facilities, in their staff, and their services. They put more into those communities where their members are located, especially small rural communities. It can be a really striking difference that other businesses have concluded there's not much profit there. They have run-down facilities. They may eventually even withdraw their services. The co-ops are trying to spruce things up, have really nice facilities, renovations, new facilities. They've been doing a lot of that in the last 10 years. And the point I want to make here is that is a strategy. It's a brand strategy. It's a business strategy, but it's conditioned by the governance. The co-op is doing that because it's locally owned and it's looking to meet the needs and aspirations of members to have services in their local community. A different example would be Mountain Equipment Co-op I mentioned earlier. It's not local in its geographic base. It's all across Canada. But MEC devotes a share of its profits to invest in causes and charitable causes that are related to the environment, to outdoor recreation, to wilderness and habitat preservation, which are some of the values that the members of the co-op share. So that's why in the bullet I say it's according to how membership is defined, co-ops invest where the members are or in what the members care about. A second thing that may not be obvious, but I have certainly heard from people in cooperatives that this is part of their lived reality, is that because of how they're owned, cooperatives usually have a long planning horizon when they're looking at developing their business strategies. One way to put it is they're not driven by quarterly returns the way some publicly traded companies might be. So it isn't about shareholder value, getting a return within 3 months. The co-ops, if they have the agreement of their stakeholders, their members, most importantly, can make investments that will pay off only over 10 or 20 years. And I've seen them do that. So it isn't necessarily about quick returns. Co-ops have to stay in business. They have to be viable, but they can choose to make very long-term investments. Interesting story about that. One of the managers that I interviewed very recently was someone who had worked for one of the very large Japanese corporations. So one of the technology companies in Japan. So one of the household name kind of technology companies. And he was describing to me how the Japanese company was invested in long planning horizons, total quality management as well, but all of those approaches that Japanese corporations are famous for. And he said that coming to the co-op, it was actually kind of the same thing. Working for a large cooperative business, he kind of said it had the same feel as kind of one of those big Japanese companies in this respect, that it had that long planning horizon. Third thing about co-ops is that their values shape their relations with stakeholders. How they do this varies a bit from co-op to co-op, but generally speaking, co-ops aspire to treat their employees a little bit differently, to treat community stakeholders a little bit differently, because of that value set that I mentioned earlier. That's part of their definition, so that's again, people often talk these days about how businesses are cultivating values. Co-ops have that, and it's kind of built in. That's part of what they are too. And a fourth thing that's different is that co-ops develop capacity in the community, and they do that because of the membership dynamic. Other forms of business may be, formed by people who are detached from the business, or perhaps they're expert business people who are getting involved. But co-ops are formed by relatively ordinary people, consumers, farmers, professionals, whoever's interested in the business of the co-op, not by specialists in that line of business. And as a result, when members go to meetings, when they participate in consultations, when members get elected to the board of directors, when the board gets trained, those are people learning new roles. And that's part of where this emphasis on education, training, and information comes in, is there people learning how to participate in the strategic direction of a business. And that builds capacity in people and in the communities they come from. I mentioned hundreds of communities across Western Canada where the co-ops that I'm studying are present. Every one of those co-ops has, at any given point in time, 10 or 12 people on their board, and probably a wider group that are involved in different member committees and meetings. Those people get experience in the co-op, and anecdotally, a lot of them then also end up getting onto the local school board, the municipal council, whatever other local leadership there might be. So it's a feature of cooperatives, because of their membership dynamic, that they develop capacity in communities. And again, sometimes that's a desired outcome, and that's a reason to choose a co-op. So I mentioned the co-ops I've been working with as examples of that. And now there's some qualifications. I mentioned I was describing a kind of an ideal type. Co-ops are subject to marketplace competition. And competition in the marketplace can compel them over time to look and act like their competitors. So academics call that isomorphism, that they come to take the same shape as the organizations they're competing against. It's not universal, and it's not inevitable, but it's certainly something to be aware of, that the competitive pressures, especially with older cooperatives, ones where members are less engaged, may have that kind of an impact on them. But it matters a lot how each particular co-op is led and governed. So just the point that's highlighted there, that's something to pay attention to in this regard. Typical governance problems in co-ops, just to say a word about it, just thinking about that board-manager relationship, that sort of common governance issue that people talk about. Sometimes the board is too strong and kind of meddles in management's affairs, and the manager, who's the professional who's on the job all the time, doesn't have the scope to make the business work properly. Or conversely, sometimes management is too strong and dominates the board, and the board doesn't learn to ask the tough questions to provide the checks and balances, the input into strategy formulation that you want in a really well-functioning co-op. So those are the kinds of things that co-ops are prone to. You could say all boards are prone to them. In co-ops, what you want to think about is the fact that because it's owned by the users, the boards are usually lay people. They're not professional board members. And so you see some of these things take particular forms. So things that co-ops look at is the competencies of their directors, and whether the values and goals of the co-op are shared by their managers. And those are some of the keys to making co-ops work. So training and development, succession planning, how you recruit, making room for co-op identity and values in the planning and in the strategy. Those are some of the things that co-ops do to address these potential weaknesses in the model. So finally, I want to say just some quick words about creating and developing co-ops, and then I'll wind up in just a couple of minutes here. So co-ops are, as I mentioned in the definition, you could think of them as self-help in a group. So they're founded by groups of people who choose to take responsibility for something to do with their future. Individual leadership also matters when co-ops are being formed. But as I pointed out on the slide here, if there's no group, there's no co-op. So I have come across now and then someone who thinks founding a co-op is a really good idea. And this person is sure that some other group of people should join in and help them. But it's really just one person driving the whole thing. And when there's only one person driving the whole thing, that's often a bit of a sign that a co-op is not a good fit. A different way to put it is that for co-ops, the development of the group comes first and precedes the development of the business. So the first stage is always the development of a group, their capacity, their common vision, collective leadership, and following from that then the development of business plans and incorporation. So key difference between how you create co-ops and how you create other forms of business. And just remember, it's an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their own needs, jointly owned, democratically controlled. So those are the pieces that need to be there at the beginning if it's going to work as a co-op. There's successes and failures we could talk about. One that I find interesting is the history of cooperatives for Indigenous people in Canada. We had failures in the mid-20th century when government officials decided that co-ops ought to be a good fit for First Nations or Inuit people or Métis people. And the co-ops that were formed by government officials, more or less, to bring Indigenous people along with them. These were officials of provincial governments and of the Government of Canada. Those co-ops generally didn't work very well. But we do have counterexamples. I've mentioned on here Arctic Cooperatives Limited. It's worth Googling. Tremendous network of really successful co-ops in communities in Canada's Arctic. Difference between success and failure: whose idea was the co-op, whose needs is it meeting, and what's the cultural fit for the members. So just interesting to think about that case and what it shows about the development of co-ops. There are studies that suggest that once a cooperative is formed, their survival rate over 5 years is better than other small medium enterprises. They have distinctive advantages in terms of member buy-in and loyalty, disadvantages accessing capital. That's some of the characteristics of many small co-op startups. And I think there's a lot of successful co-ops out there that start small and develop their capacity as they grow, rather than starting big when they kind of don't have that capacity yet. Developing co-ops is about education, training, and information. It's about the values. And I've given a link here to the Plunkett Foundation in the United Kingdom, who are kind of exemplary in their model for development of co-ops. If you're interested in founding a co-op, it's a good website to check out. So wrapping up, that was something about the definition of co-ops, history and examples, governance and strategy, and just a few observations about creating and developing them. And that is kind of the end of the slideshow. So I certainly would be happy to address any questions that people have in the time remaining.
Well, thank you very much, Brett. So this is the beginning of our question and answer portion. So any of you, if you have any questions, please type them into the question area on the right-hand portion of your screen. But just to begin, I'm interested in following up on one point you did make, Brett, about developing capacity as cooperatives grow. So as you mentioned, they're not formed by specialists. So what about sourcing external talent, whether it be managerial talent or technical talent? And particularly, I'm thinking of big ones like things like federated cooperatives.
You know, it's a great question, and there's big debates among cooperatives in terms of how to address those challenges, and different co-ops have chosen different paths. So there isn't one solution. I would say that the co-op system that I'm working with currently is one that historically has been skeptical about bringing outsiders into the top level management positions. And there have been some bad experiences with trying to do so, and not to say it's never worked. But what they have tended to find is that the culture and the values in cooperatives are so strong that it's difficult to bring in a peak manager who's used to a for-profit or a not-for-profit and have them make that adjustment quickly enough. So a lot of the people I've interviewed would say you should bring in outside talent, but not at the top level. You should bring it in a level or two below that and let the people kind of grow within the system and get used to it. With that said, there are certain cooperatives that have brought in people from outside. The wheat pools, which existed for the better part of a century, actually made it their almost a policy that they would bring in managers from the private grain trade to run the cooperatives. And that worked for them for many years. I guess you could also say the wheat pools aren't around anymore. So maybe that was part of the reason for it. But I would say it's a mixed experience, and it's an issue that co-ops themselves debate. So that's a great question.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Brett, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. It's an introduction and overview of cooperatives in agriculture. If you have any further questions, please feel free to get in touch with myself and perhaps you, Brett. They could find your contact details online. And well, again, thank you for everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.